record levels. Electricity costs surged 30 to 100% under Biden, and the typical family lost $5,000 to $10,000 in higher energy costs. Think of that, $5,000 to $10,000 you lost. On day one, I declared a national energy emergency. Gasoline is now under $2.50 a gallon in much of the country. In some states, it, by the way, just hit $1.99 a gallon. And within the next 12 months, we will have opened 1,600 new electrical generating plants, a record, and it's a record that won't be beaten by practically, I would say, by anybody, or certainly not very soon. Prices on electricity and everything else will fall dramatically. The Democrat inflation disaster, again, the worst in the history of our country, also...
Listen to me very carefully, because what you just witnessed is nothing less than a full frontal assault on reality itself, a comprehensive masterclass in the weaponization of economic misinformation, designed to insulate reactionary political power from accountability, while American families hemorrhage money from their bank accounts. This is not merely hyperbole or political exaggeration. This is the systematic dismantling of truth in service of fossil fuel interests and the billionaire class, and I need you to understand the stakes here, because we are watching in real time as household electric bills have gone up 13% nationally since Trump took office. While this man stands before the American people and proclaims himself their economic savior, and the sheer audacity of it would be breathtaking if it weren't so catastrophically dangerous for working families who are quite literally choosing between heating their homes and putting food on their tables right now in December 2025. Let me drop the first bombshell that should detonate every single claim Trump just made. American households paid $12 billion more for natural gas in the first 9 months of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024, meaning the average American family has paid $124 utility service since Trump took office due to rising natural gas prices. Read that again and let it sink into your bones, because this is the opposite of what he just told you. Residential natural gas prices are up 98% since Trump took office and 8% year over year. Not down, up, explosively up. And yet Trump has the unmitigated gall to stand there claiming families lost thousands under Biden, when the empirical data, the cold hard numbers that cannot lie the way politicians can, demonstrate that his policies are actively driving energy costs through the roof at this very moment. Now here comes the second bombshell, and this one should shake you to your core. These higher prices are primarily caused by record LNG exports, a direct consequence of Trump's energy dominance agenda that prioritizes shipping American natural gas overseas to maximize corporate profits, while 1 in 6 Americans, 21 million households, are behind on their energy bills. Let that moral obscenity wash over you, because this is the material reality of neoliberal extractive capitalism masquerading as populist economic policy. Trump is literally exporting American energy affordability to foreign markets, enriching fossil fuel executives while working-class families in Texas, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and across this nation fall into utility debt. And then he has the propaganda apparatus to turn around and blame Democrats for a crisis his own administration manufactured. The gas price claims are equally pernicious in their deception, and here we need to excavate the layers of manipulation embedded in this rhetoric, because today's AAA national average is 2.80 as of December 18, 2025, which means his claim of gas under $2.50 a gallon nationally is simply false, and the average U.S. gas price on December 9, 2025 was $2.95 per gallon, nowhere near his $1.99 in some states' triumphalism that cherry-picks isolated data points to construct a fabricated narrative of success. But here's where the intellectual dishonesty becomes truly sophisticated. Even if gas prices have moderated from their 2022 peaks, average pump prices were about $3.53 versus $2.46 during Trump's earlier 4-year term, a gap experts link to post-pandemic demand recovery and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, rather than solely to policy, meaning that global macroeconomic forces and pandemic-era disruptions explain price fluctuations far more than any president's domestic energy decisions. But Trump needs you to believe he personally controls the global oil market, because that's the only way he can claim credit for forces utterly beyond his control. And now the third bombshell crashes down with the force of empirical inevitability. The reconciliation bill alone is estimated to increase annual energy costs more than $16 billion in 2030 and more than $33 billion by 2035. Because at a time when we need every electron we can get, the reconciliation bill is causing many clean energy projects to be canceled. This is the perverse contradiction at the heart of Trump's entire energy narrative. the fatal flaw that exposes the whole reactionary project. He claims to be lowering energy costs while simultaneously threatening or canceling 324 clean energy projects, stalling $53.05 billion in clean energy investment, and putting 165,531 clean energy jobs on the chopping block, which would have generated enough electricity to power 13 million homes. Precisely when electricity demand is surging from data centers and AI infrastructure and industrial reshoring. The claim about opening 1,600 new electrical generating plants within 12 months is so spectacularly divorced from reality that it borders on hallucinatory, and I want you to understand that this number has no basis in any credible energy forecasting or infrastructure planning, because if you order a combined cycle natural gas turbine today, you'll be lucky if it puts its first electron on the grid before 2032, which means the physical infrastructure timeline for power plant construction makes Trump's claim literally impossible, not difficult or ambitious but actually impossible, given engineering and regulatory realities, and yet he states it with such brazen confidence that millions of Americans will simply accept it as truth because the sheer audacity of the lie provides its own perverse credibility. Here's the fourth bombshell detonation, and this one illuminates the class warfare dimensions of Trump's energy agenda. Wind and solar are now largely cheaper than fossil fuels like natural gas and coal, and adding more renewable energy to the grid helps keep utility bills lower, which means that Trump's war on clean energy is functionally a regressive tax on working families designed to protect fossil fuel industry profit margins at the expense of consumer affordability. An independent analysis from Energy Innovation shows that U.S. household energy bills will be higher over the next decade, now that Republicans have passed Trump's tax and spending bill, which shredded incentives for cheap forms of energy like wind and solar. This is not complicated economics. This is deliberate policy sabotage, and when Trump rails against the green energy scam, what he is actually doing is preventing the deployment of the cheapest electricity sources available to American consumers, because his political coalition depends on fossil fuel industry campaign contribution, and the cultural resentment politics of climate denialism. The inflation narrative deserves its own sustained deconstruction, because it represents perhaps the most sophisticated piece of economic gaslighting in Trump's entire rhetorical arsenal. The year-over-year inflation rate in January 2021, the month of Biden's inauguration, was about 1.4%, while the Biden-era inflation rate did peak at about 9.1%, but that peak occurred in June 2022, after Biden had been president for more than 16 months, and within that peak followed Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, which sparked global increases in energy and food prices. So Trump is attributing to Biden's domestic policies an inflation surge that was fundamentally driven by pandemic supply chain disruptions and a European land war that sent energy markets into chaos, a global phenomenon that affected every industrialized economy, and conveniently ignoring that the United States actually performed better on inflation than most peer nations precisely because of the policy interventions Trump now demonizes. But let's dig even deeper into this worst inflation in history claim, because it reveals the ahistorical nature of reactionary economic propaganda. The inflation of the 1970s and early 1980s was far more severe and persistent, reaching over 14% in 1980, which means Trump's claim is literally false on its face, and more fundamentally, the inflation Americans experienced in 2021-2022 was primarily driven by too much money chasing too few goods in a pandemic-disrupted supply chain environment, a classic demand-side inflation scenario that had virtually nothing to do with climate policy or renewable energy investment. But Trump needs to conflate inflation with environmentalism, because that's the only way to weaponize legitimate economic anxiety into a cudgel against climate action. Now let me guide you through the fifth bombshell, because this one exposes the environmental justice dimensions that Trump's narrative completely erases. As of November, Texas had the highest number of residents in utility debt, with more than 943,501 households with overdue balances. Where Texas is precisely the state where fossil fuel dominance is most entrenched, and where deregulated energy markets have repeatedly failed consumers through disasters like the 2021 winter storm that killed hundreds and left millions without power. The states suffering the most from energy unaffordability are not the ones pursuing aggressive clean energy transitions, but rather the ones that have allowed fossil fuel interests to capture regulatory apparatus and prevent the grid modernization and renewable deployment that would actually lower costs. Connected to the rest of the continental U.S. by the state of New York, elected leaders and green activists have combined to lock Boston and New England into a status quo energy system that cuts off access to renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and hydropower, as well as domestic natural gas capacity, and by opposing local substation upgrades, transmission lines for hydropower imports from Quebec, and pipelines bringing Appalachian shale gas, politically powerful elites are using federal laws like NEPA and state laws to subject their lower-income neighbors to unnecessary price volatility. This complexity matters because it demonstrates that energy affordability is undermined both by fossil fuel dependence and by poorly designed opposition to necessary infrastructure. But Trump's simplistic narrative can only process green energy bad, fossil fuels good, when the reality demands nuanced policy that accelerates clean deployment while ensuring reliability and affordability. The sixth bombshell brings us to the heart of who actually pays for Trump's energy agenda. In July 2025, the Trump administration and congressional Republicans pushed through a GOP budget bill that's driving up utility costs and destroying jobs by removing cheaper, cleaner energy sources from the grid, all while funding new tax breaks for the oil and gas industries. This is naked class warfare, the upward redistribution of wealth from consumers to energy company shareholders disguised as energy security. And since Trump took office, gas and electric utilities have raised or sought to increase bills by more than $85 billion. Let that number reverberate through your consciousness, because while Trump claims to be fighting for working families, his actual policy legacy is enabling utility companies to extract tens of billions of additional dollars from ratepayers while simultaneously cutting the tax credits that would help those same families install rooftop solar or heat pumps or energy efficiency upgrades that would permanently lower their energy burdens. The home ownership claim represents yet another layer of economic mystification that demands immediate interrogation, because Trump is trying to attribute complex housing market dynamics driven by interest rates, supply constraints, construction costs, and speculative investment to Democratic energy policy, which is absurd on its face. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates to combat inflation, which made mortgages more expensive, which priced millions of potential homebuyers out of the market. But that monetary policy was a response to macroeconomic conditions, not controlled by any single domestic policy initiative, and to suggest that renewable energy tax credits somehow caused mortgage rates to surge is to fundamentally misunderstand how interest rates, housing supply, and real estate markets actually function in a complex modern economy. But Trump needs a villain. He needs someone to blame for the anxiety and precarity that working-class families feel, and Democrats pursuing climate action provide a convenient scapegoat for systemic failures that are actually rooted in financialized capitalism, private equity colonization of housing markets, and decades of underinvestment in affordable housing construction. Here comes the seventh bombshell, and this one should radicalize anyone who cares about democratic accountability. Trump is fundamentally lying about the electricity cost trajectory under his own administration, because energy bills in the United States have risen 13% in 2025, since President Donald Trump took office earlier this year, and yet he stands before cameras claiming that prices on electricity and everything else will fall dramatically when his policies are demonstrably causing the opposite outcome. As a result of canceled or delayed projects since Trump's election, 24,958.5 megawatts of planned energy generation have been lost, enough to power more than 13.17 million homes, which means that Trump is constraining electricity supply precisely when demand is accelerating, which is economics 101 for how you drive prices upward, and prices are expected to rise further, largely due to growing energy demands from data centers and extreme weather conditions. This is the supply-side catastrophe that Trump's fossil fuel revanchism is creating, and it will hit working families hardest because energy costs are regressive, meaning lower-income households spend a higher percentage of their income on utilities, making energy inflation a particularly cruel form of economic violence against those least able to bear it. The philosophical and historical context here matters immensely, because what Trump is doing represents a retreat from Enlightenment empiricism into a pre-modern politics of myth and tribal identity, and I'm not being hyperbolic when I say this threatens the very foundations of democratic governance. Karl Popper warned us about the dangers of immunizing political claims from falsification, of creating narratives so totalizing that no evidence can penetrate them, and that is precisely what Trump's energy propaganda represents. A closed epistemic system where any price increase under Democrats proves their policies failed, while any price decrease under Republicans proves their genius, where global market forces only matter when they support the preferred narrative and disappear when they contradict it, where the physical realities of electricity grid operations and power plant construction timelines become irrelevant compared to the mythological power of a strongman's proclamations. This is not conservatism in any meaningful philosophical sense. This is authoritarian epistemology that subordinates truth to power, and it should terrify anyone who understands that democratic self-governance depends on a shared commitment to empirical reality as the foundation for political deliberation. Let me bring in the eighth bombshell, because this exposes the corruption of expertise and institutional capture that enables Trump's propaganda. Energy Secretary Chris Wright said that President Donald Trump's pro-energy policies will stop rising electricity prices and eventually reduce costs during the president's term, while Energy Secretary Chris Wright said the Trump administration is stopping a rise in electricity costs that occurred under former President Joe Biden, which represents the complete subordination of technocratic expertise to political messaging. Energy Secretary Wright knows, or should know if he's remotely qualified for his position, that the data directly contradicts his claims, that electricity prices are rising under Trump, that his policies are canceling the clean energy projects that would lower costs, that LNG export policy is driving domestic natural gas prices higher, but he says what he needs to say to maintain political favor, because that's how authoritarian capture of institutions works. The experts who should be providing independent analysis become mouthpieces for regime propaganda, and the regulatory agencies that should protect consumers become vehicles for industry profit maximization, and this is how democracies die, not through dramatic coups, but through the slow erosion of institutional integrity, until no one can trust any official source of information. The progressive alternative here is not complicated, but it requires us to be honest about the tensions and trade-offs involved, and this is where I want to challenge the activist left's occasional tendency toward utopian thinking that ignores legitimate working-class concerns about affordability. The Green left has pursued a transition strategy that exposes vulnerable communities to higher, less predictable prices while obstructing reforms that would enable faster and wider deployment of clean energy projects. And the strategy of procedural obstruction backfires when it adds interminable delays to clean energy projects and prolongs the life of coal and oil-fired power plants. We need to confront this reality with intellectual honesty, because activist-driven policies focused on blocking new energy infrastructure without adequate replacement solutions have made electricity and heating even less affordable for working-class families, and across the U.S., a failure to balance climate ambition with affordability is alienating working-class voters and exacerbating economic inequality. This is the political crisis that enabled Trump's demagoguery, the authentic affordability anxiety that working families feel, and if progressives cannot offer a credible pathway to decarbonization that materially improves people's lives and lowers their energy burdens, then we will continue losing the political argument even as the scientific case for climate action becomes more urgent. The ninth bombshell illuminates what an actual progressive energy policy would look like, and why it's superior to both Trump's fossil fuel revanchism and the most rigid forms of activist environmentalism. Most working-class voters are neither abolitionists nor climate deniers, with 54% majority support for a combination of old and new resources, including nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal, and natural gas, to power our growing economy while reducing greenhouse gases. This is the pragmatic center that can support both climate action and affordability, that understands we need massive renewable deployment alongside grid modernization, transmission expansion, energy storage, and yes, some continued natural gas as a bridge fuel and reliability backstop during the transition. Genuinely progressive energy and climate policies must assure working and low-income Americans that they will gain good jobs and consumer benefits as our nation moves toward a decarbonized economy, linking the vital and inseparable national goals of assuring abundant and affordable energy while lowering greenhouse gas emissions, pursued in tandem because we won't build majority support for climate action if Americans fear it will lead to higher energy costs. This is the political economy of climate transition that can win, that can build the durable coalition necessary for sustained policy implementation, but it requires confronting corporate power, accelerating clean energy deployment through permitting reform, investing in workforce transition, and directly subsidizing energy costs for low-income households through programs that Trump is actively trying to eliminate. Trump's promise of 1,600 new power plants deserves sustained mockery, because it exemplifies the cargo cult understanding of energy systems that pervades reactionary politics, the belief that you can simply will industrial infrastructure into existence through executive declarations without grappling with capital requirements, engineering timelines, workforce constraints, supply chain logistics, grid interconnection queues, environmental reviews, or any of the material realities that govern how power plants actually get built. The United States currently has roughly 11,000 electric generating units of all types and sizes, and the idea that Trump could increase that by 15% in a single year is pure fantasy, the kind of authoritarian numerology that Soviet planners used to engage in when they proclaimed that the next 5-year plan would triple steel production through sheer revolutionary will, and it deserves the same derision that historians rightfully heap on command economy magical thinking. But millions of Americans will hear that number and believe it, because Trump said it with confidence, and this is how propaganda displaces reality in the public imagination. The 10th and perhaps most damning bombshell concerns the direct harm Trump's policies inflict on the most vulnerable Americans who can least afford higher energy costs. Extremely low-income households earning less than 30% of the state median income bear a disproportionately high energy burden, with approximately 1 in every 7 households having an average energy burden of 14% compared to 3% for non-low-income households. This is energy poverty on a massive scale. Nearly 20 million American households spending such a high percentage of their limited income on utilities that they're forced to make impossible choices between heating and food, cooling and medicine, and Trump's policies are making this crisis worse by driving up natural gas prices through LNG exports, by canceling clean energy projects that would add cheap electricity supply, by repealing efficiency standards that would lower consumption, by blocking heat pump and weatherization programs that would permanently reduce energy burdens for low-income families. This is not abstract policy debate. This is material suffering, and every penny that energy prices rise under Trump's watch represents food that won't be purchased, medicine that won't be filled, economic precarity that will push families into debt and desperation. What makes Trump's entire performance so corrosive to democratic culture is that it models a politics where empirical claims need no evidentiary basis, where contradicting yourself from one sentence to the next carries no consequences, where the performative confidence of authoritarian messaging overwhelms any expectation of truth-telling, and this is fundamentally incompatible with the epistemic requirements of self-governance, because voters cannot make informed decisions if the information environment is so polluted with lies that ascertaining basic facts becomes impossible. Hannah Arendt warned that the result of systematic lying is not that people believe the lies, but that they become cynical about the very possibility of truth, that they retreat into tribalism and identity because those seem more stable than any empirical foundation, and that cynicism is corrosive to democratic participation, because if nothing is true, then why bother engaging at all? Why not just support whoever speaks to your resentments and fears, regardless of what they're actually doing in office? The 11th bombshell brings us to the climate dimensions that Trump's narrative completely erases, the planetary stakes that make his fossil fuel revanchism not merely bad economics but civilizational suicide. Every delay in clean energy transition, every coal plant kept running, every renewable project canceled, every efficiency standard repealed, increases the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and accelerates the warming that is already causing catastrophic damage through intensifying hurricanes, expanding wildfires, prolonged droughts, deadly heat waves, and agricultural disruption. The economic costs of climate change already exceed hundreds of billions of dollars annually in the United States alone, through disaster damages, agricultural losses, health impacts, and infrastructure destruction, and those costs will accelerate exponentially as warming continues, meaning that Trump's short-term fossil fuel subsidies are purchasing long-term economic devastation on a scale that will make current energy price fluctuations look trivial by comparison. But conservative politics cannot process long-term collective risk. It can only understand immediate individual costs, which is why climate policy becomes so politically vulnerable to the kind of demagoguery Trump specializes in. The home electrification and building weatherization programs that Trump and Republicans are actively dismantling would have created more than 250,000 jobs in 2023, with 142,000 in clean energy alone, and clean energy jobs grew more than twice the rate of the overall economy, which means that Trump is not merely raising energy costs, but also destroying the job creation engine that could provide good-paying union careers in manufacturing, installation, and maintenance for working-class Americans currently struggling with wage stagnation and economic precarity. This is the perverse irony of Trumpian economic populism. It claims to fight for workers while actively sabotaging the industrial policy that would create millions of working-class jobs. It promises prosperity while cutting programs that would permanently lower household expenses. It rails against elites while enacting tax policy that enriches fossil fuel executives and utility shareholders at consumer expense. This is not economic nationalism or working-class solidarity. This is oligarchic plunder wrapped in populist rhetoric, and the only way to combat it is relentless truth-telling about who actually benefits from these policies and who pays the costs. The 12th and final bombshell concerns what happens next, and why organizing resistance to Trump's energy agenda must become a central progressive priority. Every Republican who rubber stamps Trump's anti-energy agenda should pay the political price in 2026, and that means sustained grassroots mobilization to educate voters about the material connection between Trump's policies and their rising utility bills, to build local coalitions that demand clean energy deployment and grid modernization, to protect the clean energy tax credits and efficiency programs that lower costs for working families, to challenge utility rate increases that funnel consumer money to shareholders, to demand that Democratic politicians offer a compelling affordability-first climate agenda, rather than defensive temporizing. This fight is winnable because the economics favor clean energy, because working families actually do care about both affordability and climate, because renewable deployment and efficiency investment genuinely lower costs while creating jobs, but winning requires confronting corporate power, requires challenging the fossil fuel industry's political capture, requires building the organizational capacity to sustain pressure over years and electoral cycles. What you just witnessed in that clip was a man lying with authoritarian brazenness about economic realities that directly affect whether working families can afford to heat their homes, and the only adequate response is sustained truthful counter-propaganda that relentlessly exposes the gap between Trump's claims and the material reality of rising bills, canceled projects, increased utility debt, and policy choices that enrich fossil fuel companies while impoverishing consumers. This is the work, this is the fight, and the stakes could not be higher because energy affordability determines whether families eat, whether they stay warm, whether they can build economic security, and Trump's policies are making all of that harder while he gaslights the nation with fantasies about 1.99 gas and 1,600 new power plants that exist only in his propaganda imagination. We must be the antidote to that poison. We must be the voices that speak truth when power demands silence. We must build the political movement that can defeat this fossil-fueled authoritarianism and replace it with a genuine progressive energy transition that delivers both climate justice and economic affordability, because the alternative is catastrophic for working families and planetary survival alike.